For years, the story of Apple's founding has been compressed into a single, heroic image. Two Steves in a garage, building the future on a workbench. That image is the official story. It's the version you've seen in movies, in the biographies, in the 40-year-long press release that Silicon Valley wrote about itself. The lone genius, the college dropout, the misfit who built a billion-dollar company from nothing. But the official story has a problem. It leaves out the other 10 people in the room. And it leaves out what happened to them after the narrative moved on. The story you've been told is not wrong in its details. It is wrong in its structure. It frames everything as a personal triumph, a tale of individual will overcoming the system. The lesson you're supposed to absorb is that if you are brilliant enough and stubborn enough, the world will bend to your vision. The garage door opens, the stock price rises, and everyone who was there at the beginning walks away. Rich. That second part is the one that doesn't hold up to weight. If you trace the actual financial trajectory of the 12 people who were on Apple's first payroll in 1977, what you find is not a story of equal opportunity rewarded. You find a mechanism, a wealth filter, a system that sorted the original employees into two groups with almost perfect efficiency. And that sorting had almost nothing to do with talent. What happened to the original 12 after Jobs left in 1985 is not a collection of individual biographies. It is a case study in how wealth transfers upward, even within a startup that created hundreds of billionaires. It is a micro-scale version of the same pattern that governs the entire economy. The people who held equity through the full cycle became independently wealthy. The people who sold early, or who never received meaningful equity, ended up in a completely different financial universe. The same company, the same initial opportunity, the same starting line, different zip codes at the finish. Let's start with the surface answer, because you've heard it before. The surface answer says that the original 12 were a mix of geniuses and support staff, that some had the vision to hold their stock and others made mistakes, that the ones who ended up rich made smart decisions and the ones who didn't made poor ones. The surface answer is the standard meritocratic narrative applied to a single famous case. It sounds reasonable. It sounds like common sense. But common sense is not the same thing as evidence. When you actually open the documents, when you trace the stock grants, the vesting schedules, the tax events, and the liquidity moments, the pattern that emerges does not match the meritocratic explanation. It matches something else entirely. Layer 1 of the unwrap begins with a simple question. How much equity did each of the original 12 actually receive? The answer is not what the mythology suggests. The two Steves were co-founders. Yes, they each owned a significant percentage of the company at incorporation. Diluted over time, but still substantial. Mike Markkula, the angel investor, owned a major block because he put up the initial capital. Those three people were in a category of their own. Then there was everyone else. The remaining 9 employees were hired at various salaries, some with small stock option grants, some with no options at all. Chris Espinosa, who joined as a teenager writing code, received options that would eventually be worth millions if held long enough. Bill Fernandez, who actually introduced Jobs to Wozniak, received a much smaller grant. Daniel Kottke, Jobs' college roommate, and the person who assembled the first Apple I circuit boards by hand, received options so small that when he sold them early to cover living expenses, the total was barely enough for a down payment on a house in California. This is not a story about bad decisions. This is a story about a mechanism that distributes wealth according to timing of entry, negotiation position, and relationship to capital, not according to contribution. Kottke's case is instructive because it breaks the meritocratic frame completely. He was Jobs' closest friend during the founding period. He worked alongside him assembling the first computers. He was present for the critical early months when the company's trajectory was being set. But he was hired as an hourly technician, not as a co-founder. He had no leverage to negotiate equity. He was paid a wage, given a token option grant, and expected to be grateful for the opportunity. When Jobs was forced out in 1985, Kottke had already left Apple in 1979. He had sold his tiny options position to cover rent. He had no further claim on the company's growth. When Apple went public in 1980, the people who benefited most were the ones who held significant equity through the IPO. Kottke was not one of them. The person who benefited most from Apple's growth, outside of the founders and Markkula, was probably Chris Espinosa, not because he was more talented than Kottke, but because he stayed. He held his options through the dark years of the late 1980s and early 1990s when Apple's stock was flat. He held through the return of Jobs in 1997. He held through the iPod, the iPhone, the trillion-dollar valuation. Espinosa is the only one of the original 12 still employed by Apple as of 2024. His net worth is estimated to be substantial, though he has never disclosed the exact figure. Espinosa did not make better decisions than Kottke. He made different ones, yes, but the decision to hold was enabled by a factor that is almost never discussed in the meritocratic narrative. Espinosa had the financial cushion to wait. That cushion came from his options grant, which was larger than Kottke's. That larger grant came from his negotiation position, which was stronger because he was hired as a software developer rather than as an hourly technician. The difference in role was not a reflection of talent disparity. It was a reflection of who happened to knock on the door at what moment. This is layer one of the unwrap. The surface answer says it was about smart decisions. The evidence says it was about initial position in the equity hierarchy. That initial position was determined by factors the employees did not control. Layer 2 goes deeper. That initial position, being in the right role at the right door, is the invisible variable the meritocracy story never mentions. If you want to keep unwrapping these layers with us, subscribe so you don't miss what Layer 2 reveals about the system we are told is fair. And drop the words initial position in the comments if you have personally seen or been on either side of this invisible lottery that decides more than effort ever does. After Jobs left Apple in 1985, the company entered a period of stagnation that lasted over a decade. The stock price did not meaningfully appreciate between 1985 and 1997. For employees who held their options through that period, the financial incentive to stay was weak. Many of the original 12 left during these years. Rod Holt, the engineer who designed the power supply for the Apple II, left in 1985. He joined a consulting firm. He later worked with Tesla's battery management team. He was a brilliant engineer whose work was essential to Apple's early success. But he left at the wrong moment. He sold his options during a period when Apple's future was unclear. Had he held for another 12 years, he would have been a multi-millionaire many times over. Wigginton left in 1985. He co-founded a software consultancy that built early versions of Microsoft Windows. He later became a Stanford professor. He produced important work in computer science, but his Apple options were sold during the same dark period. Hutchinson left in 1987. He became VP of Marketing at Sun Microsystems. His Apple options were sold to fund a home purchase. Capps left in 1995, just before the iPod era began. His options had vested, but he sold them during the restructuring of the Macintosh division, when morale was at its lowest. These were not bad engineers. They were not bad decision-makers. They were people making reasonable choices with imperfect information, under financial pressure, during a period when the company's survival was genuinely uncertain. The idea that they should have foreseen the iPod and the iPhone and held their stock for 20 years is only obvious in retrospect. At the time, Apple was losing market share. Its product line was a mess, and analysts were predicting its acquisition or bankruptcy. The mechanism that sorted them out was not talent. It was the simple fact that their options vesting schedules happened to coincide with a period of maximum uncertainty, and they had no other capital to absorb the risk. Consider the asymmetry. Jobs left Apple in 1985, but retained the 11.3% of Apple shares he owned at the time. He did not need to sell them because his net worth was already substantial enough that he could afford to wait. He went on to found Next, which was a commercial failure, but his Apple stock position meant he never had to worry about basic financial survival. When Apple bought Next in 1997, he returned as CEO, and his Apple shares, which he had never sold, were worth hundreds of millions. The original employees who stayed, like Espinosa, had enough options to create a meaningful financial cushion. The ones who left, like Holt and Wigginton and Kottke, had options that were small enough that they felt compelled to sell them during the valley period. There is no moral difference between these groups. There is only a structural difference. The amount of equity you had determined whether you could afford to wait. Layer 3 reveals the mechanism that makes this pattern repeat across the entire economy. Inheritance of capital is the strongest predictor of net worth in the United States. The Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finances has tracked this for decades. But there is also a subtler form of inheritance that operates within the same lifetime. The ability to hold illiquid assets through periods of uncertainty requires existing wealth. Wealth allows you to wait. Waiting allows you to compound. Compounding allows you to become wealthier. The people who start with more equity are the people who can afford to hold it. The people who start with less are forced to sell. This is not a bug in the system. It is the core gear of the wealth accumulation machine. The mechanism selects for those who are already inside it. When you apply this gear to the story of Apple's original 12, everything shifts. The question is no longer who made the best decisions. The question becomes who was placed in a position to make those decisions. Jobs and Wozniak were co-founders. They owned large blocks. They could afford to wait. Markkula was the investor. He owned large blocks. He could afford to wait. Espinosa was a long-term employee with a substantial option grant. He could afford to wait. The others had smaller grants. They could not afford to wait. They sold. They left. They built good careers elsewhere. But they did not become independently wealthy from Apple. They were the people who built the product, while the founders built the fortune. The classic biographical framing of Apple's early years treats this as a story of genius and grit. The unframed version is a story of mechanism. The people who were in a position to wait became rich. The people who were not did not. The same company, the same time period. Entirely different outcomes determined by a factor that is never mentioned in the mythology. If you have ever felt the goalposts move faster than you could run, this is the axis they shifted along. You were told the game was fair because the rules were the same for everyone. They were never meant to be played by the same people. The mechanism assumes you start outside it. Here is what the numbers actually show. In 1985, when Jobs left Apple, the company had approximately 4,000 employees. The combined wealth of the founding team and early investors was already substantial. The total stock option pool for non-executive employees was significant, but distributed unevenly. The people who held their options through the 1985 to 1997 valley experienced a compound annual return of roughly 25% from 1997 to 2012. The people who sold during the valley experienced a return of zero on those options. The difference between holding and selling was not a difference in intelligence. It was a difference in liquidity. People who had other income sources or existing wealth could hold. People who needed the cash could not. Stop. Look at what this means for the common advice. You hear about building wealth through stock ownership. The advice says to invest early in high-growth companies and hold for the long term. That advice is correct as a mathematical statement, but it is useless as a practical recommendation for someone who does not have existing wealth. The ability to hold illiquid assets through long periods of uncertainty is itself a form of wealth. The advice presupposes the very thing it claims to create. This is the part where the mechanism becomes visible. You can see it operating not just in Apple's history, but across the entire venture capital and startup ecosystem. The founders and early investors hold large blocks. The employees receive smaller grants with vesting schedules that force them to sell during critical moments. The wealth flows upward. The structure is designed that way. Bill Fernandez, the person who introduced Jobs to Wozniak and was Apple's first employee, received a relatively small option grant. He left in 1985. His options were sold. He later co-founded BIOS Technology, a biotech firm that went public. He served on the board of Apple's charitable arm. He had a solid career, but he did not become a billionaire from Apple. The difference between Fernandez and the multi-millionaires who held their Apple stock is not a difference in contribution. Fernandez was literally the person who connected the two founders. Without him, there is no Apple. But contribution does not determine equity allocation. Timing and negotiation position determine equity allocation. Fernandez was hired before the company was formally incorporated, before the equity structure was fully designed. He had no leverage. He was an early employee, but not a co-founder. That classification difference cost him hundreds of millions of dollars in potential wealth. You were told that the startup world rewards contribution. It rewards position. Those are not the same thing. The original 12 Apple employees represent a perfect natural experiment. 12 people who started at the same point in the same company. 11 of them had exit events during the period 1979 to 1995. One of them held through to the present. The distribution of outcomes is not normal. It is not a bell curve. It is a bimodal split. The people who had large equity grants and could afford to hold became wealthy. The people who had small grants and had to sell built comfortable but not independent lives. That is the pattern you need to see. A natural experiment, 12 people, one company, and a bimodal split that tells you everything about how equity really works. If you want to keep uncovering these hidden patterns, the mechanisms that determine who wins and who breaks even, subscribe so you do not miss the next case study. And drop the word bimodal in the comments if this kind of forensic breakdown is what you came here for. The mechanism that produced this split is not unique to Apple. It is the standard pattern of equity distribution in high-growth companies. The founders take the majority. The early executives take meaningful positions. The early engineers and technicians received token grants that are designed to be incentive-compatible, but not wealth-creating. The company narrative celebrates the idea that anyone can become a millionaire through stock options. The actual statistical outcome is that most option grants are never exercised at peak value. Most employees sell during down periods or at IPO when the price is lower than the long-term peak. The IRS data on incentive stock options confirms this. The average realized gain from ISO exercise by non-executive employees is less than $50,000. The median gain is even lower. The stories of life-changing wealth from stock options are real, but they are concentrated among the top 1% of option holders. The wealth does not trickle down. It funnels up. Let's return to the specific case of Daniel Kottke, because his story carries the emotional weight of the mechanism. Kottke was Jobs' college roommate at Reed College. He followed Jobs to California. He lived in the garage with him while they were building the first Apple iBoards. He manually soldered components onto circuit boards for hours every day. He was present at the creation of the company. When Apple was formally incorporated in 1977, Kottke was offered a job at $600 per month. He was given a small option grant that was standard for entry-level technicians. He did not complain. He was grateful to be part of something important. In 1979, Kottke decided to leave Apple. He was not fired. He was not dissatisfied. He simply wanted to travel and to explore other interests. He had $14,000 in savings from his Apple salary. He sold his option grant for $2,000 to cover expenses. That option grant, if held through to 2024, would be worth approximately $12 million at current market prices. Kottke does not describe himself as someone who made a mistake. He describes himself as someone who made a choice based on the information he had at the time. He did not know that Apple would become the most valuable company in the world. He did not know that his tiny option grant would one day be worth millions. He made a rational decision based on his circumstances. He did not have the financial cushion to hold illiquid stock for decades. The mechanism did not select against him because he was lazy or unintelligent. It selected against him because he was young, had no capital, and needed cash to live. The same mechanism selected for Espinosa, who was slightly more senior, had a slightly larger grant, and had slightly more financial breathing room. These are not dramatic differences. They are marginal differences that compound over decades into life-altering gaps. After leaving Apple, Kottke co-founded a venture capital firm. He invested in Netscape and eBay. He became a philanthropist. He donated $5 million to the University of Colorado Boulder in 2022 for STEM education. He ended up wealthy by ordinary standards, but not by the standards of early Apple employees. The comparison with Markkula is instructive. Markkula invested $250,000 in Apple in 1977 and was given a one-third ownership stake. He served as CEO, then chairman, then sold his shares in 1991 for approximately $100 million. He went on to become a venture capitalist, investing in Next, Intuit, and Netscape. Markkula did not work on the assembly line. He did not solder circuit boards. He did not write code. He wrote a check. That check entitled him to one-third of the company. The people who built the product received a fraction of that. This is not a criticism of Markkula. He took a genuine risk. Without his capital, Apple would not have survived its first year. But the difference between the investor and the technician is not a difference in labor or in contribution to the final product. It is a difference in access to capital. The mechanism is clearer now. Kottke worked with his hands. Markkula worked with his capital. The capital was rewarded at a rate thousands of times higher than the labor. The labor was necessary, but it was not ownership. This is the core gear. Capital compounds. Labor does not. Capital can wait. Labor must be paid now. The person who has capital can hold through periods of uncertainty. The person who only has labor must sell their equity to cover their expenses. Over time, the capital holder accumulates more capital. The laborer trades their potential future wealth for present survival. The gap widens. If this pattern feels familiar to you, it is because you have lived it. Maybe not in a startup, but in a promotion that never came, in a house you could not afford to keep, in a retirement account that was cashed out to cover an emergency, in a moment when you had to choose between paying the bill and holding the investment. The system is designed to test your staying power, and the people who designed it already know how the test comes out. The Apple Original 12 story is not ancient history. It is a blueprint that is still in use today. Every startup, every venture deal, every IPO follows the same distribution pattern. The founders take the bulk. The investors take a large slice. The employees receive options that are designed to incentivize, but not to enrich. The wealth flows upward. New companies emerge every year and recruit talented people with the promise of equity. The pitch is always the same. You can be part of something. You can get in early. You can share in the upside. The pitch is not false, but it is structurally incomplete. It omits the part about how the upside is distributed. It omits the mechanism. Here is the question that the mechanism asks. Do you have enough capital to wait through the valley? If the answer is no, your options will be sold during a low period. You will be compensated for your labor, but not for your position. You will have worked on the product, but not owned the outcome. This is the layer that changes how you see the startup world. It is not a meritocracy. It is a capital selection mechanism disguised as a talent lottery. When Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, he brought a new board, a new strategy, and a new equity plan. The people who had held their shares through the valley were rewarded beyond anyone's expectations. The people who had sold were spectators. The same pattern repeated on a larger scale. The lesson is not that you should hold every option grant until it becomes a fortune. The lesson is that the ability to hold is itself a form of capital that is unevenly distributed. The system rewards patience, but patience requires a cushion, and the cushion requires existing wealth. The circle closes on itself. The original 12 employees were not a representative sample of the American workforce. They were a group of highly talented people who happened to be in the right place at the right time. But even within that group, the mechanism sorted them based on equity position and liquidity, not on talent or effort. The difference between the ones who became wealthy and the ones who did not was a difference in initial conditions. Those initial conditions were determined by factors the employees did not control. The mechanism did not care. You walk away with the same numbers they used to sell you the dream. Only now you see the crack where the light gets in. The dream was never a door that opened for everyone. It was a machine that processed talent into wealth for the people at the top and processed talent into labor for everyone else. The question the mechanism asks is not whether you have what it takes to succeed. The question is whether you have what it takes to wait for the success to arrive. And the answer to that question is predetermined by your starting position. You were told the game was fair because the rules were the same. They were never meant to be played by the same people. The mechanism assumes you start outside it. Now the question becomes what you do with that knowledge. You cannot change the mechanism. you can change your relationship to it. You can stop blaming yourself for selling at the wrong moment. You can stop telling yourself that if you had just held, you would be rich. The mechanism was not designed for you to hold. It was designed for you to sell. The quiet revolution is internal. It is the moment when you stop accepting the frame and start seeing the shape of the board. The mechanism will not change overnight, but your relationship to it can change now. You can see it. You can name it. You can decide whether to keep playing its game or to design your own board. The original 12 Apple employees are not cautionary tales. They are evidence of a pattern. And once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. You cannot go back to believing that the system rewards effort equally. You cannot go back to blaming yourself for the structural gaps. You can only move forward with clearer eyes. Chris Espinosa held on. Daniel Kottke sold. The difference was not talent. The difference was position. That position was not earned. It was allocated. The allocation was not meritocratic. It was structural. This is the uncomfortable clarity that stays with you after the story ends. The promise was real, but it was never meant for everyone. The garage door opened for the founders. It stayed open just long enough for a few others to step through. The rest built the product and watched the door close. The next time you hear a story about a startup that made everyone rich, remember the original 12. Remember the technician who soldered the boards and the investor who wrote the check. Remember that the mechanism has not changed. The names have changed. The industry has changed. The pattern has not. You are not a failure for leaving early. You are not a failure for selling. You are making a rational decision inside a structure that was not designed for you to win. The mechanism was always going to produce this outcome. Now you know. You felt it, did you not? That moment when the promise clashed with the paycheck. The promise said that hard work in the right place would make you wealthy. The paycheck showed that the wealth was allocated before you arrived. You are not imagining it. And you are not alone. I have compiled the data that proves this pattern across the entire startup ecosystem. The numbers are clear. The mechanism is visible. And the first step is to stop accepting the frame. The ones who always knew the score are the ones who stop blaming themselves and start seeing the mechanism. That move is available to you right now. The numbers that confirm this are not hidden in obscure journals. They are published openly by the Federal Reserve, the SEC, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The data on option exercise patterns, on employee stock sale timing, and on wealth concentration in startup ecosystems is public. The mechanism is not a secret. It is simply never assembled into a single picture. The picture is not hidden. It is scattered. And that scattering is itself part of the mechanism, keeping the pieces so far apart that no single person can see the full shape. If you want to keep seeing the full shape, subscribe so the next piece lands in your feed while the pattern is still forming. And in the comments, leave one word, assembled, to mark the moment you started putting it together. The SEC filings of venture-backed companies that went public in the 2010s show a consistent pattern. The median employee option grant at IPO was worth approximately $80,000 at the offering price. The median employee held that stock for less than 18 months after the lockup period expired. Most sold at or near the IPO price. The companies that went on to have the highest post-IPO returns, like Zoom, like Shopify, like Mercado Libre, had employees who sold their shares during the first 2 years of trading. The founders and early investors held. The employees sold. This is not a failure of employee foresight. it is a structural inevitability. The IPO creates a liquidity event. The employees have been holding illiquid shares for 4 to 6 years. They have mortgages, tuition payments, medical expenses. They have been waiting for the moment when they can convert paper wealth into cash. The founders and early investors have multiple sources of capital. They can continue to wait. The employees cannot. The mechanism works at every scale. At the level of the individual startup, at the level of the venture capital fund, at the level of the public stock market, capital flows to those who already have it. The system is not a ladder. It is a conveyor belt that moves wealth in one direction. Now consider what this means for the advice you hear about building wealth through employee equity. The financial media tells you to join a startup, to negotiate for stock, to hold for the long term. The advice is not technically wrong, but it omits the precondition. The ability to hold requires either existing wealth or a high enough salary that you do not need to sell. Most startup employees have neither. They are trading their future equity for present liquidity without knowing it. The ones who benefit from this advice are the ones who already have the resources to follow it. The advice is self-selecting. It works for people who do not need it to work. This is the layer where the mechanism stops being abstract and starts being personal. If you have ever held stock in a company and sold during a downturn, you are not making a mistake. You are following the logic of your financial position. If you have ever cashed out a retirement account to cover an emergency, you are following the same logic. The system penalizes you for needing the money. It rewards the people who do not need it. The idea that financial success is a matter of discipline and patience is only true for people who have the financial cushion to afford discipline and patience. For everyone else, the same choices are labeled as mistakes. The label is the only difference. You were told that the path to wealth was a straight line of good decisions. The data shows that the path is a series of gates, each of which requires capital to pass through. The first gate is the job that offers equity. The second gate is the ability to hold that equity through uncertainty. The third gate is the compounding that follows. Most people stop at the first or second gate, not because they are undisciplined, because they lack the capital to pass through. The mechanism has a name. Economists call it the capital accumulation advantage. Thomas Piketty called it the tendency of capital to grow faster than the economy as a whole. The financial industry calls it compounding. None of these names capture the asymmetry. Capital does not just grow faster. It also has the ability to wait. Labor does not have that ability. The difference is not in the rate of return. It is in the patience of the holder. When you see a startup founder who held through multiple down rounds and eventually became wealthy, you are seeing the mechanism at work. The founder had the control to stay. The employees who left during the down rounds did not have control. They had a vesting schedule and a need to pay rent. The Apple story is not an exception. It is the rule. The mechanism has been operating in plain sight for 40 years. Every startup generation rediscovers it. Every generation of employees experiences it. The names change. The pattern does not. The original 12 employees were not unlucky. They were not victims of bad timing. They were participants in a system that was designed to produce exactly the outcome it produced. The founders and investors became wealthy. The early employees who could wait became comfortable. The early employees who could not wait became the labor that built the product. This is not a story about Apple. It is a story about every company where the people who did the work are not the people who own the outcome. It is a story about every industry where capital compounds faster than wages. It is a story about the gap between the promise and the paycheck. The promise said that if you worked at a great company, you would share in its success. The paycheck shows that the sharing is not equal. It was never meant to be equal. The mechanism was designed to funnel the gains upward. Now, the question is not whether you see the mechanism. The question is what you do with the seeing. The first step is to stop interpreting your own financial history through the lens of personal failure. You did not make bad decisions. You made rational decisions inside a structure that was not designed for you to win. The evidence is in the numbers. The evidence is in the option grants. The evidence is in the liquidity moments that forced you to sell. The second step is to recognize that the mechanism is not destiny. Seeing the shape of the board changes your relationship to it. You can stop chasing the startup lottery. You can stop blaming yourself for not holding. You can start designing your own financial strategy based on the reality of the mechanism, not on the myth that surrounds it. The people who always knew the score do not talk about it. They do not need to. They understand that the game has structural rules. They play within those rules, but they do not mistake the rules for fairness. They know that the wealth they accumulate is not a reflection of their virtue. It is a reflection of their position. You can see that position now. You can see that the difference between the founders and the employees was not talent. It was access to capital. You can see that the difference between the employees who held and the employees who sold was not discipline. It was liquidity. The mechanism is visible. The frame is broken. The new question is what you build in the space where the old story used to stand.